This series of short videos is designed to provide you background and context for the readings we'll be doing each week in the seminar. They will provide you with information on the social, historical, and literary background surrounding the particular era.
Why bother with all that? I'm not gonna read anything for this class anyway.
You don't have to memorize all this stuff, but some knowledge about all the eras will be on the final test you take in May, and this is where you'll get it.
Oh shit.
Of course, any division into particular historical eras is somewhat arbitrary, but for our purposes we will be following the one provided in the Harper's Anthology of American Literature. If you can find a copy, you can read it all there. For each historical era, you should know 1. Its name, 2. The dates associated with it, 3. What the dates represent, 4. The basic characteristics of the era, and finally, a few important names. You do not have to know all the personal details of the author's lives, when they were born, died, names of their firstborn children, their shoe size, or any of that stuff. All you need to be able to do is place them in the proper historical era. So, shall we begin at the beginning? Technically, no one really knows when, because the first tales were the oral stories Native American tribes passed on from generation to generation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many of them were written down. But you can learn about some of those in the Native American class. For our purposes, we will start when the first Europeans arrived, in 1492. And that means we know the first words of American literature. Of course, this was in Spanish and paraphrased from the original diary, which we no longer have. But it does tell us the genre of writings during this first era: diaries and travel journals. So the name of this first era is The Literature of the New World, which runs from 1492, when Columbus first landed in what is now the Bahamas, to 1620, when the Pilgrims landed in New England and permanent settlements began. Thus, characteristic of the first era is, naturally, exploration of the New World by European explorers who wrote diaries and travel journals. Important names include Spaniards such as Hernando de Soto, who came to the American South, Ponce de Leon, who came looking for the Fountain of Youth, and Balboa, who was the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. While the Spanish came up from the south through the Caribbean, Mexico, and Central America, the French arrived in the north, navigating the rivers and the Great Lakes as they sought to trade fur with the natives. One famous French explorer was Jacques Cartier. Another was Samuel de Champlain, who founded Quebec toward the end of the era. The Dutch arrived in the early 17th century as well. The most famous explorer for the Dutch was Henry Hudson, after whom the Hudson River in New York is named. But the most influential explorers were those Englishmen who helped establish the first settlements, in particular John Smith, who led the Jamestown colony in what is today Virginia. Smith was already famous when he was chosen to lead the colony, having already fought against first the Spanish and then later the Turks, who captured him. Smith eventually escaped and made his way to Transylvania, where Zsigmond Báthory gave him a knighthood. From there, he returned to Britain and almost immediately signed on to the Jamestown enterprise, which set sail in 1607. He is most famous, however, for his encounter with Pocahontas, the daughter of an Indian chief, who supposedly saved his life after he had been captured by the Indians and was about to be executed. But is this story true? 3 things speak against it. 1. The language barrier. How did he know what was going on around him when no other Europeans were there? Pocahontas was later a translator between Indians and Europeans, but that was later. 2. Smith didn't mention this incident until nearly 10 years later, at a time when he was writing in order to encourage more settlers to come to Jamestown. 3. Smith was known for exaggerating, and this story is remarkably like one he had told about a Greek woman who supposedly fell in love with him and rescued him from execution by the Turks. But the myth lives on. No, Pocahontas was not as old as Disney portrayed in their film. She was only 11 when the incident happened. No, Pocahontas did not fall in love with John Smith. She did marry a tobacco planter later and go to England. She died there of smallpox, a disease that killed many Native Americans. So why did this legend survive? Perhaps because this was how Europeans wanted to see Native Americans. At least some Indians are good and like whites, in particular the women. The image is, one must admit, somewhat sexist. Consider this. What if a white woman fell in love with an Indian? Such incidents did happen, but for centuries they were never glorified the way the Pocahontas story has been. Instead, each generation has thought of Pocahontas in ways that reflect their own values. Which brings us to the main point. The Europeans who came to the New World all saw it based on what they wanted to see or find there. Smith returned to England in 1609. Pocahontas died there in 1617. All this before the end of the First Era in 1620. Why the difference in dates? We'll talk about that next time.
Is it over?